Hey, friends, welcome back to the Guardians of the Future podcast. I'm Justin Latta. We're going to have a special guest this week on the podcast. It's going to be Travis Sawchik from The Score. Travis is going to join us to talk about the collective bargaining agreement and Major League Baseball's lockout. Understand if some fans really aren't wanting to talk about it, wanting to hear about it, they're not really happy with how things are going in baseball and they don't want to get into that. They're tired of hearing about it. Completely understand if that's not for you. Feel free to skip this one and check us out again next week. And I'm rejoined by Willie Hood and Joe Koblitz as we get into some prospect stuff going into the new year. But if you're interested, Travis is a really good guest. He is a Cleveland native, and he has covered the collective bargaining agreement lockout on The Score when things first happened earlier in December. He's written a book, Big Data Baseball, when he was covering the Pirates for the Pittsburgh Tribune Review, kind of their statistical data revolution that happened a couple years ago when they were really getting good. That was a great book. One of the first books I read, getting into baseball's data revolution. He's written for Fangraphs, the Athletic Cleveland, 538. So for my money, one of the best baseball enterprise writers out there. He was a great beat writer for the Pittsburgh Tribune Review and has just done a lot of good baseball work. And I really encourage you to go check him out on Twitter. It's Travis_Sawchik. That's SAWCHIK. To follow his work, check out Big Data Baseball if you haven't yet. If you're interested in getting into the beginnings of analytics and the analytical revolution of baseball. And yeah, Travis took the time to talk to us today. We're really appreciative of that. It was a great conversation. And if you're looking to be more informed about the collective bargaining agreement and the lockout between players and owners, definitely a podcast you're going to want to listen to because Travis explains it all and has way better concepts of this than I could imagine. So feel free to, take a listen. We hope you do. And really grateful for Travis for joining us. And if we don't catch you this week, we will catch you next week. Thank you. All right. Well, we promised you someone, excuse me, who knows a lot more about the Major League Baseball collective bargaining agreement situation and who's written about it and has a few more good ideas about it. We've asked Travis Sawchik from The Score to join us, and he has graciously given us some of his time, a lot of it actually, some inside baseball. We've tried to do this for a few minutes now, and we're finally now just getting the recording going. So, Travis, thanks for taking extra time out of your day now to do this.
Hey, great to be with you. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, we really appreciate it. Travis, if you haven't seen his work, he's been all over the place. I'm going to try to get all these right. I think I've seen you at the Pittsburgh, what paper was it in Pittsburgh? The Tribune Review.
That's right. That's correct.
Fangraphs, The Athletic, 538.
That's right.
538, and now The Score.
A lot of stickers on the suitcase. But, yeah. I need to pick just one place and stick there for a while. Yeah, let's.
Yeah, someone should definitely do that. You've put out a lot of good work over the years. I know I started following you when you were covering the Pirates, and also the author of Big Data Baseball, one of the first data books I think I've read as far as analytics on baseball is concerned. So if you've never checked that out, I highly encourage you to buy that book. I know it's, Travis, that's a few years old now, but I think it still goes back to a lot of where baseball is today.
Yeah, that was published in 2015. It feels like 20 years ago because the game has changed so much since then. But I think some of the lessons hold up well. But that was pre-StatCast and still, somewhere between where we are today and the early analytics age. But I think there's still some interesting lessons to be taken from that book.
Yeah, it's a good place to start, for sure. I definitely enjoyed that book, and I encourage anybody else to go check it out if they're looking for a place to start with baseball's growing analytics. So let's get into the CBA a little bit. I thought your thread was interesting back on December 2nd when this kind of all started unraveling. Especially the argument. I think a lot of the common fans look at this as the millionaires versus billionaires thing, and you kind of broke it down, in a really good way to make it easier to understand that's not really what it is. But for the common fan out there who kind of thinks that this is a millionaires versus billionaires fight, why is that not wholly accurate?
Yeah, I think what gets lost is that most players are not millionaires, and if uh, we focus on the average salary, and the average salary has been above $4 million since 2016. That's a big number, of course, but most players, never reach free agency. Most players don't reach later into arbitration. The median dollars earned in 2019, which is the last year I have the complete data for, is $558,000. So you think about, uh, that tells us that most players are pre-arbitration, and in 2019, 63% of all players that step on a field were pre-arb, and they accounted for 56 days of service time accrued. And uh, the average career is shortened. If you look at 2003, the average service time was 4.8 years, and in 2019 it dropped to 3.7. That'd been a pretty consistent decline. As I think part of it is teams understand aging better. They understand they have aging models, and most free agents are over 30. And careers have been pinched on the front end as teams try to delay service time and reduce arbitration years and get an extra year of club control. So I think there's that trend of career shortening, and just the way the teams game the system to their advantage, where they're leaning on the minimum salaried player more than other major sports. And I think that kind of gets lost in this discussion about billionaires versus millionaires. It's really, yes, it's the owners versus the top tier players too, but there's this other group that I think doesn't really have the same voice at the table, and that is the most common kind of career outcome, that player who is making less than $600,000 per year.
I'm glad you said that because you look at the representatives from the players' side. It's Max Scherzer, Marcus Semien, Francisco Lindor, and Andrew Miller. Those guys in the last 10 years or even 5 years have all signed very significant contracts, and they're the ones kind of across the table right now with the new lawyer. And I think maybe that's maybe an issue for fans where they're seeing a lot of millionaires, guys who are prominent in baseball, who are kind of making the decisions, and maybe that's why they feel like it's the 1% versus Major League Baseball. But do you feel like those players are bargaining in the best interest of the rest of the league, or do you feel like there is still a bit of it is kind of the 1% versus Major League Baseball in these negotiations right now?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard Andrew Miller and people at the union say, they're interested in the interests of all players, and I'm sure that they would love to help every group of players, but I do think owners have leverage over players generally in these negotiations because they're a smaller group. There's only 30 owners. Well, I think there's like two corporations and 28 individual ownership groups, but they're a more cohesive group. They're all very wealthy people, and there's fewer of them. And players have a much more diverse constituency, come from different backgrounds, different wealth levels. So it's they're two different groups, and players have shorter careers. So owners just inherently have more leverage. So then the players can probably only, whatever they're going to win out of this, it's probably going to be, they're not going to get everything they want. So then when you think about what chess pieces are they willing to give up, it seems like a lot of the focus is again on protecting the top free agency, the top earning potential, and hoping that trickles down. And they can say they're looking out for players and all players, and I'm sure they are. You just wonder as the negotiation, whenever they heat up again, probably after the new year, uh, when both sides start looking at what's less important on their priority list, you do wonder uh, where that most common career outcome, where that's going to fall. I mean, I do like the one idea I thought was really compelling from the player side was this idea of a bonus pool for pre-arbitration players, but I don't think owners are that that into it. And the salary floor I thought is really interesting from the owner side, but the players don't want to lower the tax levels, so that seems to be a non-starter at this point. So I don't know what is going to help. The player we kind of addressed early on.
Yeah, I mean, the salary floor would be good for players in theory, but obviously they've never wanted to be tied to a salary cap. So that's probably why it's not anywhere on their priority list. But they're probably not coming to the table with their best offers right now, as we've seen so far. I also find it interesting too, in a juxtaposition to other sports, is that you wrote free agency requirement hasn't changed in baseball since 1976. And in the meantime, I think we've probably had a ton of changes to the NHL and the NFL and the NBA in the meantime. So it just kind of boggles my mind that, it's been so many years and nothing's changed with the other sports. It feels like they've gone through a lot of CBAs and more has changed for them, but baseball has remained the same, which, I guess we shouldn't be surprised by, because that's kind of how baseball was for a long time. But it kind of feels like something has to change now because it has been so long and the other sports are way ahead, like you said, in terms of what the minimum player is making and free agency requirements. But yeah, I just have no idea if we're going to get there anytime soon.
Yeah, no, it is pretty wild that free agency hasn't changed since '76, and arbitration really hasn't changed at all since 1991. I think the only thing that's changed is that Super Two has gone from 17% to 22% of those players with more than 2 but less than 3 years of service time, and that's really the biggest change we've seen in either of those systems, which is pretty crazy because careers have shortened. Teams have all this, 21st century, which Cleveland really ushered this. The A's got all the credit in Moneyball, but it's really uh, the John Hart's group started that, and it's changed, shortened careers. Teams have gotten smarter about free agency. We've seen small market teams maybe not sustain success, but Cleveland has had great bursts of productivity. Tampa Bay's sustained it better than most, and they've learned how to win more efficiently and cheaply. And the CBAs really haven't, they haven't evolved to match that. And we hear about how players have baseball's the strongest union, but I don't know, the results. The results seem pretty league friendly the last few cycles. So we'll see. If I'm a player, I want a much higher minimum wage. I want earlier arbitration, and I know the players want to try to reduce free agency to 5 years, which that would be great too. But even at 5 years, most players are not going to reach that number. Their careers will end before then. So I think there's too much of an obsession about average salary and absolute share of the revenue pie. I'd be more concerned about the median outcome. How are you helping those players? Because you're much better off if you have the median type of career. You'd be better off playing another sport. And I think the public perception looks at the guaranteed contracts, and there's no length. There's there's no ceiling on a baseball contract. You could sign for X years. There's no limits, but that really only helps a very few amount of players, and I don't think it trickles down. And so it'll be interesting to see how this all plays out, because there's been so little change, but it feels like something has to change.
Yeah, Rob Manfred put that pretty good in his letter that, they said we're told free agency is broken, and then he referenced the spending spree by owners right before the lockout, and that's just the 1%. Like you mentioned, that's the 1% of contracts. That's not the average career, and the average age of rookies is getting older because of service time manipulation, and like you said, careers are getting so much shorter. You just really, I personally, as a baseball fan, hope that it does trickle down. You hope that the players are fighting for the guys that are into the 0 to 3 years in terms of service time to make it better, because that does help the game long term. And as you said, the last couple CBAs for sure. It seems like the players negotiated for a lot of creature comforts and some other things that benefited them travel wise and day off, but not necessarily further the progress and the health of the game, which is kind of why we're here. And one of the things we like to focus on in this podcast, obviously it's called Guardians of the Future, so we look at prospects a lot. I don't expect there to be any talks about this. No one's going to mention it, but obviously there's no mention in these CBA talks so far that they're going to help minor leaguers. I suppose if they help younger players get paid earlier, that's good, but probably no thought to helping. I mean, those players aren't part of the union, but probably no progress in terms of helping the minor leaguers out. Would you say?
Yeah, unfortunately, they're not part of. They're not represented by anyone at the table, and the major league players have so many of their own issues to address. How much energy can they I mean, I think we would all, everyone who covers the game and has a role in writing about it or podcasting about it or covered in some media, we'd all like to see minor leaguers get a better deal. But yeah, I just don't think they have a seat at the table. And I think the owners are doing a few things. Like we've seen some housing situations improve and that sort of thing, but nothing so dramatic. And that's what I think a lot of people, even hearing I got some pushback talking about the median salary, and people were still saying on Twitter and elsewhere, like, well, that's still a lot of money. And it is. But if the average career is less than 3 years and you're in the highest federal tax bracket and you still have cost of living and all that, you're maybe taking home 25-30% of that. And to get there, you spent multiple years in the minor leagues, which was probably a negative cash flow experience. And you're also probably a decade plus removed from any, education, some training other than baseball. So you're going to need, most of these guys need second careers, and they've not saved enough money to retire or anything like that. And that is sort of tied to the minor league issue for those that make it and don't have long careers. So you would like to see minor leaguers get a better deal cut, but it just doesn't seem like it's going to happen in this cycle because there's so many other issues to get through.
Yeah, I think in the past it felt like maybe the major leaguers did not want to fight for the rights of the minor leaguers because they're not part of the union, and I am told that's kind of that's okay. It's kind of how unions work. If you're not in it, they're not going to fight for you, and they don't have a seat at the table. But it's not like there's another sport or another league besides the independent leagues they can really go play in. So they don't really have. I guess that goes to a more of an antitrust issue than it does a CBA issue, but. That is a whole other conversation to have. And you just brought up your point with Rob Scahill too, who, didn't play a very long time and didn't have a whole lot saved. Someone like Juan Soto would get a ton of money in the free agent market right now as a arbitration eligible player. But you're right. Someone like Rob Scahill, and I think a couple of podcasts ago, I went to the example of Chris Carter, who led the Brewers in home runs one year. And I think the next year he was non-tendered. He was scheduled to go to arbitration, and the Brewers decided to non-tender him. And then he caught on with a couple other teams, but ended up playing in Korea. But you see a lot of these teams just aren't even bothering to go to arbitration anymore because they know they're not going to pay these guys, whatever they're going to get in arbitration, because they could potentially get the same production for a lot cheaper from somebody in the minor leagues or make a trade for somebody. And that's, again, goes back to kind of where we are as players who have not reached the arbitration age. And I feel like that is something that has to be bargained, is arbitration or some sort of bonus, like you said, has to come sooner, because otherwise teams are going to continue to non-tender these players before they have to pay them, anything over $1 million, it seems like.
Yeah, I think, Eddie Rosario was, another, it's not just the pre-arb guys, it's also the spread between the minimum pre-arb salaries and arbitration has grown so wide that teams are more apt not to pay even a productive player like Rosario was cut by the Twins and ended up in Cleveland. So that's another problem. And I just think, if we want to look at it from the fan perspective too, which gets overlooked, I think baseball, the players and the owners should look at what would make this a more consumer-friendly sport. And the salary floor, to me, would be great. I mean, you would have to have more teams participate in the off season and trying to supplement their roster and that sort of thing would be really good for interest as a whole. And I think I don't know, when I go through scenarios, that's something I think the players should be more open to. They should be willing to sacrifice some ceiling to get the bottom quartile teams up and more competitive. And maybe that can help out the arbitration, kind of that middle tier class of player who is more apt to not be tendered a contract when they get into ARB 1, ARB 2, and some of the non-star free agents. So yeah, there's a lot to work through here, but I do wonder if teams could step away and players could step away and think, what would just make the game more interesting as a whole? And because that could drive revenue growth, that would drive interest levels, possibly if they did some consideration of just being more fan consumer friendly.
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of teams' fans would have liked to have been part of the frenzy that happened before the lockout. I mean, obviously the lockout sped up all those big signings, and it was the 1%. But if you kind of had a better free agency model, more teams could build excitement in their fan base by adding players, making transactions. That's just one way to go about it. But it kind of feels like we're a little bit away from there. I'm really curious with the salary floor because teams have been so good at circumventing certain rules over the years. So I look at the Oakland A's and I think, okay, they're rumored to trade everybody that's above arbitration level or is arbitration level. So if they go out and they have to have a minimum salary floor, do they just sign a bunch of free agents to 1-year contracts? Do they trade them for prospects at the deadline? Are there rules in place to make them spend X amount of dollars through the whole season? Or do they just have to start the year with a projected payroll of, $100 million? And if they trade those players away for prospects come, trading deadline season, it kind of circumvents the integrity of the rule. So I kind of wonder if they do that, are there going to have to be like fail safes in place where you don't have teams kind of circumventing that?
The teams will certainly look for loopholes, but I mean, it seems to me just you could write a pretty good rule where you have to spend X dollars on the season on players on your 40-man roster or whatever, 26-man roster, and you have to spend it. Now you could trade for Eric Hosmer's contract, but you have to pay it. It's not just opening day. It's not accumulating a bunch of partial contracts halfway through. You gotta throughout the fiscal year, you gotta spend X dollars on payroll or some sort of penalty. You lose revenue sharing, or I don't know, you lose draft picks or whatever they would do. Although I don't know how interested owners are going to be in penalizing themselves. But yeah, something like that. It creates more interest, more optimism. I think more enthusiasm just especially for small market fans. And we see it. Uh, yeah, I hear those concerns and they are legit, but yeah, just write a good rule and make it harder to work around.
Yeah, definitely whatever's fan friendly. I hope they do, take that step back and figure out what can make it work. And obviously, neither side has, in theory, submitted their best offer. One of the other ones was what the players we're going to use. This is a chip that was going to be eliminating revenue sharing, which obviously was a non-starter for the league owners. But I kind of wonder if maybe they put in something like, if you're part of revenue sharing, you have to spend the money on players. You can't just collect that money. You have to prove that you're spending, the revenue sharing on your payroll, whether it's a certain amount, all of it, and being able to prove it. Do you think that sounds like something that, could work its way into the negotiations?
Yeah, if I'm sitting on the player side, wondering where can we try to drive a wedge, a division in the owners group, you do wonder about some of the large market ownership groups looking at Bob Nutting in Pittsburgh, Dolan in Cleveland. Like what are they doing with this cash? Because they're not spending on major league players. So you wonder if that is an issue where there could be. I don't think revenue sharing is going away, but it has to be more pegged to major league payroll. It has to be tracked and accounted for, or incentivized. I mean, I think incentivizing winning would be good, and whether that's through draft picks or revenue sharing or what have you, uh, yeah, maybe that would be a way to get more competition from owners, because right now it feels like it's not always being directed in ways it should be to make the teams more competitive and just create a better on-field product.
And another thing that's not really fan friendly either is the way they've used the website. Now, I've seen on Twitter, and I don't know if Twitter is always a good way to capture this, but I've seen people with legal backgrounds say that removing players' pictures and content related to them is all something they've been advised to do legally. But I've seen people with law backgrounds saying they really don't have to do that. I'm not sure what advice they're getting legally, but with no baseball going on, they're not creating content in the offseason, they're not creating news. It just seems so silly. I really can't understand whatever they're being advised to do or not do. Um, it makes them look worse because you go to these websites and there's no content on there about current players, and you go to MLB Network and they're showing, Tim Lincecum's no hitter for the fifth time. I don't understand what they're doing. I don't understand how that it makes it look worse because it just shows how reliant the game is on its players when you do things like that.
Yeah, I don't think the players were going to challenge MLB on you can't have our pictures up, but I don't think that was really on their list of considerations. It felt like a move that backfired. I don't know what baseball's thought process was there. I don't even really want to speculate, but it almost gave players a symbol to rally around, and it makes the website and the network just look devoid of content, which isn't good, and it makes the players' case seem stronger because the game is dependent on them. They are the product. So yeah, that I don't know how baseball arrived at that decision, but it it didn't work as I can't imagine that's how it worked as it intended.
Yeah, well, they haven't had a labor stoppage within the era of social media, so having all those players having their anonymous pictures on their profile probably was, like you said, an unintended consequence of whatever legal advice they were getting that definitely backfired. Funny to see, but from a fan perspective, definitely not what you'd want, and definitely not a way for Major League Baseball to put himself, in any sort of news cycle this winter when things are usually dead. Like I joked the other day, like we were talking about the winter meetings, and the winter meetings, haven't been what they used to be in the last 10 years or so because of how slow things move. And I really wish we had that. Like I wish we would have even had that the last week when winter meetings would have been scheduled. Instead, we have the minor league baseball Rule 5 draft. But it's just kind of sad that, you kind of miss the buzz of winter meetings, even though nothing ever happens or nothing has happened really. But you just miss that considering baseball has taken itself out of a lot of conversations, especially because they're not even negotiating. They're going to wait until what seems like after the first of the year to get back to the table at this point.
Yeah, there's no rush. And I mean, it's better to have this period be playing out in the off season than in the season. But it feels like baseball is completely off the sports landscape right now, and baseball's doing everything in its power to make sure no one is using their pictures or writing about them on players on the website. So yeah, it's pretty wild. And I mean, November was fascinating. I think all those signings created a lot of interest. It was almost like an NFL or NBA signing period, which is a real frenzy, and fans know something's going to happen, so they're really in tune to it. And you wonder about if there some sort of transaction signing deadline, just like the trade deadlines, would help generate some interest in the future or tied to a deadline. And maybe baseball will take something from this offseason, the contrast between the frenzy of activity in November and the lack of anything in December, and learn something from that. But yeah, this quiet period is certainly interesting.
Yeah, the talk of modeling free agency, but also we haven't even gotten into, we're not going to have time to get into even rule changes. Like, you had an article recently that talked about the findings from Dr. Wills on two different balls. Like that's not even a conversation we're having because we have to get to the money part before we can get to the rules part. And I know they can impose whatever rules they want in theory, but it's just amazing that, the commissioner in Japan had to resign over being caught having two baseballs in use during their season. And this is not even a story.
I know. The ball. I'm getting a little exhausted with. There's always a ball controversy, and I don't know how much is intended to be. Like, is baseball and subsidiary and Rawlings really is this nefarious activity? They're trying to alter gameplay, and or they just was it really supply issues or material issues? I don't know, but just to be a little more transparent about issues with the ball, if there were supply chain problems, I mean, just let people know. I don't think it needs to be a big deal. But when you find out afterwards that they're using two different balls in play, that's pretty wild. And I think it just makes players even more distrustful of the league, and its intent. So yeah, the whole thing is. I don't think it's good PR. Uh, yeah, I don't know. Yeah, but to your point, yeah, a lot of rule changes that they'll have to get cut through and talk about too. And starting in January, there's a lot of work in front of these two groups to get to the finish line if they're not going to miss any games or miss any significant portion of spring training.
Yeah, let's end on that note. I want to ask you. I'm not asking you for prediction, but your general sense of knowing, maybe how much room is between the two to get to the middle and finish. Do you feel like we're in any danger of missing actual regular season games at this point? Is there a certain cutoff date where you think fans should start to worry when there's not going to be games, or when baseball should start to worry they're not going to have games, because that's another good way to agitate fans?
Yeah. I looked at this in 1995, coming out of the strike. They of course missed games at the start of that season, and they had a 19-day spring training. Uh, so figure 3 weeks is probably the most as condensed as you could get. So to not miss games, baseball and the players have to have an agreement by the end of the sometime in the first week in March. So I think that's kind of something of a deadline period. Uh, Maybe the first one is pitchers and catchers just reporting dates. That there should be maybe that's an incentive to act something as a deadline. So yeah, I mean, I guess if you're setting an over underline, I it, I think it would be: is there any games missed? It's that what half game. That's the over under. Uh, so I don't know where you would fall on that. I don't know. I kind of think there will be some games missed, but we'll see. Maybe that'll be a poor prediction. I do think both sides understand the history and that there's a lot of negative fallout from the last work stoppage that resulted in missed games, and baseball already has a lot of negative PR from the ball to, or so pace of play and all sorts of things that just seem to be bothering people. So I don't think it wants to miss a lot of games. But until there's that threat of misplay, I don't know that either side is going to want to blink. Is sort of, I feel like the players feel like they have to win something significant, and I feel like the owners have leverage and are really united. So that just seems like a tough labor battle when they're not even talking again until after the holidays. So yeah, we'll see. We'll see.
Yeah, the optimist in me says if this is really about money, neither of them wants to lose money, so they'll get it done before opening day. But it just feels like, I mean, I said before I don't think they will because of that reason. But the further and further we get into this, and the more it feels like they're farther apart, maybe it is going to happen. And I would hate to see that as a baseball fan, to see the fallout from that, like you said, because nobody playing, has really been around for the last labor strike. All they can really do is look back to see what happened, but nobody has been actively involved. But maybe that hurts them in some way. I'm not really sure, but hopefully that's not the case. Hopefully we're, talking in March and talking about opening day, because
Yeah.
I think after this winter, we're going to need it.
Yeah, it would be such a bad look to be going into March and there's still no player pictures on the website, and they're still showing Tim Lincecum and the movie network throwing no hitters. That wouldn't be good. So then I think the pressure would really start to ratchet up to get something done. And uh, I do think if the players have some resolve to miss games, that would really tighten up the owners, especially COVID really reduced their bottom line. And while the books aren't open, the Braves are one of the few teams that are owned by a publicly traded team, and according to their quarterly report, their earnings from 2020, they suffered losses, baseball related. So yeah, I do. If the players had resolved to miss games, I do think you could start to put some pressure on owners. But let's hope it doesn't come to that, because it's not good for the game.
Yeah, it's a bummer we hadn't even had to have a podcast about this, but Travis, I really do appreciate you taking the time to do this and educate our listeners. Like I said, better than I could do it. You've done
Uh,
good work so far out there on Twitter and at the Score.
well, thanks so much. Yeah, it's. I mean, it is a intellectually interesting topic, but it's one that hopefully we don't talk about too often. The threat
Yeah,
of work stoppage and that, right? And yeah, no, it's. I enjoy talking about it, even if I wish we were talking about real baseball. So good to be with you. Thanks for having me on. And
yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to come back sometime and talk about the Guardians and actual baseball stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, we should definitely do that. Travis Sawchik on Twitter, Travis_Sawchik. You can check out Big Data Baseball, even though we did say it's a couple years old, but it's a great start. Digging into baseball's data revolution, the Athletic, the Score, Fangraphs. You've been a lot of different places. Hopefully, the Score is one of those places where you stop collecting more stickers. Then,
Yeah, I'm the Oliver Perez of baseball writers. I just keep showing.
Hey, he had a great career, man. Oliver Perez had a great career, and
Yep.
the Zips projections the other day said he could still be one of the Guardians' best pitchers. So,
if
that's been your career, I think you're doing pretty good.
Yeah.
All right, thanks, Travis. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Have a good one. Hopefully you've enjoyed this podcast and maybe it's inspired you to start one of your own. This podcast was produced using Anchor, the best place to make a podcast. So let's talk about it. The first thing you need to know is that it's free. And there's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. You can even add songs directly from Spotify into your episodes. So you can create any kind of podcast episodes, whether it's music analysis, your own radio show, or something the world's never heard before. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you, so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and every other place you can listen to podcasts, and it allows you to make money from it with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go to Anchor FM to get started.